did New Zealand's wealthiest school become the centre of one of the country's biggest sexual abuse cases? At the boys-only boarding school Dilworth, hundreds of students suffered serious abuse over 3 decades. What's more, they say the school went out of its way to cover it up.
Dilworth, a school that had a sparkling reputation and a noble goal: to take in disadvantaged children and give them education, faith and opportunity. The school that promised these boys so much instead took everything from them. Nestled in the heart of Auckland's Remuera is a century-old boarding school. Its founders were James and Isabella Dilworth, a childless couple who left behind their property fortune and a lofty vision. Documents show that in 1978, Dilworth knew at least 5 other students were being abused by Peter Taylor. That number later grew to 10. The school claims it carried out an internal investigation into the offending, but says the report was inexplicably destroyed years later. The police were never called. Instead, minutes from a Dilworth board meeting show Peter Taylor was allowed to quietly resign. Peter Taylor died in 2012, aged 74. If he was alive, police say he'd likely join the list of 12 men already charged with sexual assault at Dilworth. Police launched Operation Beverley in 2019. They've already identified 139 victims at Dilworth, and investigators believe another 96 children were likely abused.
Welcome to another episode of We Were Children, a Dilworth School Survivors vlog. Today we will be looking at the Dilworth Law, an initiative of mine to make mandatory reporting of child abuse law in New Zealand. So what exactly is mandatory reporting? Mandatory reporting is currently in law throughout Australia. Let's have a look at this clip put out by the Queensland Government on mandatory reporting.
All members of the community have a responsibility to protect children. Any person in the community may report to the Department of Communities, Child Safety and Disability Services if they honestly and reasonably suspect a child has suffered, is suffering, or is at unacceptable risk of suffering significant harm and may not have a parent willing and able to protect them. In addition, there are certain professionals with mandatory reporting obligations under the Child Protection Act 1999. These include doctors, registered nurses, teachers employed at a school, certain police officers, persons engaged to perform a child advocate function under the Public Guardian Act 2014, and early childhood education and care professionals. Mandatory reporters are required by the Child Protection Act 1999 to report to child safety when they form a reportable suspicion. For mandatory reporters, a reportable suspicion about a child is a reasonable suspicion that the child has suffered, is suffering, or is at unacceptable risk of suffering significant harm caused by physical or sexual abuse, and may not have a parent willing and able to protect the child from harm. Mandatory reporters must report to child safety when they have formed a reasonable suspicion that a child is a child in need of protection caused by physical or sexual abuse. In addition, mandatory reporters may report to child safety a reasonable suspicion that a child is in need of protection caused by any other type of abuse. Any person may report to child safety a reasonable suspicion a child may be in need of protection, no matter how this arises. Where concerns do not meet the definition of a child in need of protection, an individual may continue to work with the family or take other action to help. It is important to know that reporters are not responsible for the assessment of their reasonable suspicion or the final decision makers of whether a child is in need of protection. They only need to honestly and reasonably hold a suspicion that a child is in need of protection because a child has suffered, is suffering, or is at risk of suffering significant harm, and the child's parents may not be willing and able to protect them from harm. The final determination about whether a child is in need of protection will be made by child safety. If a report is made to child safety, it must satisfy both that a child has suffered, is suffering or is at risk of suffering significant harm, and does not have a parent able and willing to protect the child from the significant harm. If both criteria are not satisfied, the matter is not investigated because it does not reach the legislated threshold for child safety to undertake an assessment. In this instance, child safety may refer the family to a Family and Child Connect service to offer support to help them get back on track before their problems escalate. Mandatory reporting, another way to keep children.
The reason I wanted a new mandatory reporting law to be called the Dilworth Law is so this event where hundreds of boys were sexually, physically, psychologically and or emotionally abused while in Dilworth School's care aren't forgotten about by Dilworth School and swept under the carpet like the abuse was. By calling it the Dilworth Law will be like etching it into the stone walls of Dilworth, so future students see the past, a reminder to be on the lookout for predators who come across as your friend. My strategy to make this happen was to create an online petition, which I did. Then present that petition to the Abuse and Care Royal Commission of Inquiry in the hope that it forms part of the final report for recommendations to government to implement the Dilworth Law. I joined forces with Neil Harding, who is a well-known Dilworth survivor advocate, to help make this happen. Together we presented the Dilworth Law to the Royal Commission. Neil did a fantastic job of presenting the petition to the Royal Commission. The emotion of the moment was really felt by Neil and myself and shared by everyone in the room.
Mr. Harding, I understand you'd like to address us first, is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for this opportunity for us to address the Commission. My name is Neil Harding. I am a Dilworth survivor. I'm middle-aged, grey-brown hair, blue suit, blue tie, light blue shirt. And with me is Greg Evans.
Yes, and I'm a senior male of large build, wearing a charcoal suit, glasses, pink shirt and tie.
Thank you.
Once upon a time, we assumed institutions, such as schools and churches, obeyed our society's laws and were therefore beyond reproach, that it was impossible for the figures of authority that ran them to do wrong and conspire to do wrong. But we have since discovered that Dilworth School chose to participate in an enormous wrong against children. They chose to cover up the vilest of sexual abuse. Over 30 pedophiles abused hundreds of boys over a 40-year period. It seemed the reputation of their organisation was more important than the welfare of the boys in their care, in contradiction to the moral values the school was supposed to reflect and live by. As survivors, our mission as part of our healing journey is to prevent the children of tomorrow being harmed by institutions that allow travesties such as this to occur. We experienced, as well as the loss of our innocence, the unravelling of many of the lives of either ourselves or our classmates and friends. We experienced the devastating news of the suicide of many of our brothers. Trauma and the loss of innocence endured by children contributes to many of the issues facing our society, especially as they enter adulthood. Their neurodevelopment is adversely impacted and causes many of them to remain in a sympathetic flight or fight response where survival is as good as it gets, let alone thoughts of a career or being capable of functional relationships. Many end up with drug and alcohol addictions. The effects of PTSD are becoming more researched and more understood. We need to do a lot better. Today, Greg Evans and I, on behalf of 170 Dilworth survivors, family and friends, present a petition calling for a Dilworth Law that would require the mandatory reporting of child abuse to police. Specifically, the petition is asking the Abuse in Care Royal Commission of Inquiry to recommend to the New Zealand Government the implementation of the Dilworth Law. This law would require a person or entity to report to police if a child or young person is at risk of significant harm, the child or young person has been or is at risk of being physically or sexually abused or ill-treated. This law already exists in New South Wales under the Children and Young Persons Care and Protection Act 1998, number 157, part 2. We were astounded to learn that in New Zealand there is currently no such law. If this law had existed and been followed when we were at Dilworth, most of us would never have been sexually abused. We appreciate the Royal Commission's understanding of survivor voice, and it would greatly help us to know that institutions like Dilworth School can never be allowed to cover up abuse again.
I was really taken back by how the Royal Commission made a special session for receiving the petition, with Judge Coral Shaw, Chair of the Royal Commission, coming down to the floor and accepting it off Neil Harding.
And I will come down and take the petition from you.
Thank you.
On behalf of the Commissioners, I accept the petition, and I assure the survivors that we will certainly take it into a deep consideration. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have to say it was a real surprise to see the Anglican Church supporting mandatory reporting.
In that regard, on this topic of preventing abuse, we have learned today of the petition that you have received. And I've only had an opportunity to speak to the primates, but they personally, the two archbishops, support the request in the petition for a law change requiring mandatory reporting of abuse.
What was even a bigger surprise was Dilworth School's response to mandatory reporting.
One of the issues that the inquiry's heard from some witnesses on and will be considering is the question of mandatory reporting and whether that should be an element of the future system design that might in fact help keep people safe, prevent abuse, so that when it's found that it's reported to the right channel and the right actions are taken at the time. Do you have a perspective yourself, from your current role as chair, of whether a mandatory reporting regime would be a useful tool in the kitty to keep boys safe?
I think it's essential. I think it's essential that people are not given the opportunity to make judgment calls, that there is a codified and legal responsibility to report abuse, particularly sexual abuse. And I note in Australia this week that there has been initiatives to try and eliminate abuse against women and children. And I think New Zealand needs to look at regimes to seriously confront the issue of abuse of children.
What was disappointing with the Catholic Church's response to mandatory reporting?
Commissioners, one of the big challenges in respecting the ethnic communities and cultures within the Catholic Church is how to address issues which we also recognise are barriers to disclosure of harm. There are a significant number of different ethnic groups in the Catholic faith in New Zealand. These groups all have deep cultural and ethnic roots to the religious expression of their Catholic faith, and those are rich and vital. But one of the challenges this presents, Commissioners, is how to address elements of those cultures which are simultaneously barriers to reporting abuse, such as respect for elders, for clericalism. Catholic leaders have taken steps to reduce clericalism in several ways within the Catholic Church in recent times. And some communities have seen this as an attack on their culture and on their faith, and this has resulted in a split in a number of communities. This is a very difficult issue, Commissioners, for the Catholic leaders to know how to address this. Further work is being undertaken, of course. Culturally informed safeguarding training is being provided, but these barriers to reporting abuse must be reduced in all communities, including ethnic communities which hold beliefs that create barriers. It needs to be undertaken, my clients recognise, in a way that's respectful to the communities and recognising their rights for self-determination. And accordingly, we would invite your thoughts and guidance on how these matters can be best addressed.
I thought initially when I saw this article in the New Zealand Herald that the Catholic Church had done a backflip and supported mandatory reporting, but I missed the detail. Snap saw through the spin and made this statement.
SNAP, Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests Aotearoa, said in a statement that the Church's proposals lacked credibility and had upset survivors. For Catholic Church leaders to say they support mandatory reporting, but with exceptions, is simply a contradiction, because mandatory reporting means there must be no legal, confessional and therapeutic privilege. Only respect for privacy at the sole request of the victim or survivor, the group said. SNAP also said that survivors were yet to see any substantial changes in the way the Catholic Church responded to abuse complaints.
I agree with SNAP. You can't have exceptions to mandatory reporting. That's why it's called mandatory. No exceptions. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Abuse and Care Royal Commission of Inquiry for the respect the Commissioners gave Neil Harding and I when we presented the Dilworth Law. Making a special time for the presentation and Judge Coral Shaw, Chair of the Royal Commission, coming down to the floor to accept the petition was really appreciated. Thank you. Please subscribe to this channel. Thank you for watching.
If Isabella Dilworth was alive today, she would